The stars above Los Angeles were never visible, drowned out by the city's neon glow and the perpetual haze of smog. But on this particular night, two stars appeared, bright, pulsating, and descending rapidly. They weren't stars at all, of course. They were ships. Ugly ships. The kind of ugly that made you question the very nature of beauty, as if the universe itself had vomited forth a pair of mismatched, asymmetrical blobs that somehow defied aerodynamics and good taste. The ships hovered silently over the Hollywood Hills, casting an eerie green light over the sprawling mansions below. And then, with a sound that can only be described as a cross between a belch and a vacuum cleaner, they descended. Inside one of those mansions, two of the most famous adult film actresses in the world, Lola Lux and Candy St. Clair, were hosting a party. It was the kind of party where the champagne flowed like water. The guests were all impossibly beautiful, and the conversations were as shallow as the pool outside. Lola, known for her sultry voice and curves that defied gravity, was holding court by the fireplace, while Candy, with her platinum blonde hair and razor-sharp wit, was busy flirting with the director who promised her the lead in his next film. Neither of them noticed the green light creeping in through the windows. Neither of them noticed the air growing thicker, heavier, as if the room itself were holding its breath. And then, the windows exploded. Not in a dramatic, shards of glass everywhere kind of way, but in a surreal, almost polite manner, as if the universe had decided that breaking the rules of physics was far more interesting than adhering to them. One moment, the windows were there. The next, they were gone, replaced by a swirling vortex of green light. The guests screamed, but their voices were swallowed by the vortex, leaving only silence in their wake. Lola and Candy, however, didn't scream. They were too busy staring at the creatures that emerged from the light. The aliens were, in a word, hideous. They were tall, with spindly limbs that seemed to bend in ways that defied human anatomy. Their skin was a mottled patchwork of colors, puke green, mustard yellow, and a shade of pink that could only be described as unfortunate. Their faces were a chaotic jumble of features. Too many eyes, not enough mouths, and noses that looked like they'd been slapped on as an afterthought. They moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, as if their bodies were puppets controlled by an unseen hand. And yet, despite their grotesque appearance, there was something almost pitiable about them. Something that made you want to look away, not out of fear, but out of secondhand embarrassment. One of the aliens, the one with 3 eyes and a nose that resembled a squashed tomato, stepped forward and pointed a clawed finger at Lola and Candy. "You," it said, its voice a guttural rasp that sounded like it had been filtered through a blender. "You are beautiful." Lola and Candy exchanged a glance. Thanks?" Lola said, her voice trembling slightly. "But, we're kind of in the middle of something here." Before she could finish, the alien raised its hand, and the room dissolved into chaos. The guests were flung aside like ragdolls, their bodies crumpling against the walls. The furniture floated into the air, spinning wildly before crashing to the ground. And then, with a sound that was equal parts horrifying and absurd, the aliens grabbed Lola and Candy and dragged them into the vortex. The next thing they knew, they were on the ship. It was, without a doubt, the ugliest place either of them had ever seen. The walls were a sickly shade of brown, covered in what looked like pulsating veins. The floor was sticky, as if it had been coated in some kind of alien mucus. And the smell, the smell. It was a combination of rotting fish, burnt hair, and something else, something indescribable, that made their eyes water and their stomachs churn. The aliens, there were dozens of them now, stood in a circle around Lola and Candy, their too many eyes blinking in unison. "We have brought you here," said the squash-nosed alien, "for a special purpose." "Yeah, we get that a lot," Candy muttered under her breath. The alien ignored her. "Our species is aesthetically challenged. We wish to improve, to become beautiful, like you." Lola and Candy exchanged another glance. "Okay," Lola said slowly. "So, what, you want us to, give you makeovers or something?" The alien shook its head. "No, we wish to breed." There was a long, awkward silence. "Breed? Candy repeated, her voice rising an octave. As in, you want us to with you? The alien nodded enthusiastically. Yes, you will mate with our chosen specimens. Your offspring will be beautiful, and we will harvest their DNA to improve our appearance. Lola and Candy stared at the alien, their minds struggling to process what they were hearing. Okay, first of all, Lola said, holding up a hand, that's not how DNA works. And second of all, the alien tilted its head, as if confused by their reaction. You do not wish to help us? No, Candy said, crossing her arms. We do not wish to help you. In fact, we'd like to go home now, please. The alien's expression, or what passed for an expression, darkened. You will comply, or you will suffer. And with that, the aliens dragged Lola and Candy deeper into the ship, to a room that was even uglier than the last. It was filled with strange, pulsating machines and tanks of bubbling liquid, and in the center of the room, strapped to a pair of tables, were two men. They were unconscious, their faces pale and their bodies limp. Lola and Candy recognized them immediately. They were two of the most famous male actors in the adult film industry. Oh, hell no, Lola said, her voice rising in panic. You are not sticking us in some kind of alien porno. But the aliens weren't listening. They were too busy preparing the machines, their too many hands moving with a disturbing efficiency. Lola and Candy struggled against their captors, but it was no use. The aliens were stronger than they looked. And as the machines began to hum and the green light grew brighter, Lola and Candy realized that they were about to become the stars of the strangest, most surreal film of their careers. And it was only the beginning. The story would continue to unfold with escalating absurdity and horror. Lola and Candy would discover that the aliens' plan is far more sinister than they initially thought. They're not just after DNA, but the very essence of human beauty, which they believe can be distilled and consumed. The male actors, meanwhile, wake up and join forces with Lola and Candy to escape, leading to a series of bizarre and darkly comedic encounters with the aliens, who are hilariously inept at understanding human biology and culture. The narrative would weave in themes of vanity, exploitation, and the absurdity of the entertainment industry, all while maintaining a surreal, WTF tone that keeps the reader guessing until the very end. The aliens' ultimate fate would be both horrifying and darkly funny, leaving Lola and Candy to return to Earth with a newfound appreciation for their own humanity and a story that no one would ever believe. The machines hummed louder, their vibrations resonating through the sticky, pulsating floor. Lola and Candy were strapped to cold, metallic tables, their wrists and ankles bound by what looked like glowing green spaghetti. The two male actors, Duke Steele and Max Fury, were still unconscious on adjacent tables, their chiseled jaws slack and their perfectly toned bodies eerily still. The aliens bustled around the room, their too many limbs flailing as they adjusted dials, flipped switches, and occasionally tripped over their own feet. This is not how I imagined my first threesome, Candy muttered, tugging at her restraints. Focus, Candy, Lola snapped, her eyes darting around the room. We need to get out of here before they turn us into some kind of alien Barbie and Ken. One of the aliens, a particularly lumpy specimen with a face that resembled a melted candle, approached Lola's table. It held a device that looked like a cross between a hairdryer and a vacuum cleaner. Do not resist, it rasped, pointing the device at her. This will extract your essence. My what? Lola demanded, her voice rising in panic. Your beauty, the alien clarified, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. We will distill it, consume it, become like you. Oh, hell no, Lola said, struggling against her restraints. You are not turning me into a smoothie. Before the alien could respond, Duke Steele groaned and stirred on his table. His eyes fluttered open, and he blinked up at the ceiling, his brow furrowing in confusion. Where am I? He mumbled, his voice deep and gravelly. Welcome to the worst porno ever, Candy said dryly. You're about to be the star of an alien breeding experiment. Congrats. Duke's eyes widened. Wait, what? Before anyone could explain, Max Fury woke up with a start, his muscles flexing as he instinctively tried to sit up. "What the?" he began. But his words were cut off as the melted candle alien turned its device on him. A beam of green light shot out, enveloping him in a glowing aura. "Hey!" Max shouted, thrashing against his restraints. "What the hell is this?" "They're trying to steal your essence," Lola explained, her voice tinged with both panic and exasperation. "Your beauty. They want to, like, drink it or something." "My beauty?" Max repeated, his tone a mix of confusion and flattery. "I mean, I get it, but—" "Not the time, Max," Candy interrupted. "We need to get out of here before they turn us into alien juice." As if on cue, the melted candle alien turned its device on Duke, who let out a yelp as the green light enveloped him. "This is not in my contract," he shouted, his voice cracking. Lola's mind raced. She glanced around the room, her eyes landing on a control panel near the wall. It was covered in blinking lights and strange symbols, but one button stood out, a large, red button with a symbol that looked suspiciously like a power switch. "Candy," she whispered, nodding toward the panel. "See that?" Candy followed her gaze and grinned. "Oh, I see it." With a sudden burst of energy, Lola twisted her body, using her legs to kick the melted candle alien in what she hoped was its equivalent of a stomach. The alien let out a gurgling screech and stumbled backward, dropping the device. Candy seized the opportunity, wriggling free from her restraints and lunging for the control panel. The alien screeched in alarm, their too many limbs flailing as they tried to stop her. "Candy, hurry!" Lola shouted, struggling to free herself. Candy slammed her hand down on the red button. The room was plunged into darkness, the machine sputtering and dying. For a moment, there was silence. And then, the room began to shake. "What did you do?" Duke demanded, his voice panicked. "I have no idea," Candy shouted back, clutching the edge of the table for balance. The shaking grew more intense, and the aliens began to screech in panic. One of them, a particularly clumsy specimen with legs that seemed to bend in the wrong direction, tripped over its own feet and crashed into a tank of bubbling liquid. The tank toppled over, spilling its contents onto the floor. The liquid hissed and bubbled, eating through the sticky surface like acid. Guys?" Max said, his voice rising in alarm. "I think we need to get out of here. Like now." Lola finally managed to free herself from her restraints and jumped off the table. She grabbed Duke's arm and yanked him to his feet, while Candy did the same for Max. The four of them bolted for the door, dodging flailing aliens and bubbling puddles of acid. The ship was shaking so violently now that it was hard to stay upright, but they managed to stumble into a corridor. "Which way?" Duke asked, his eyes wide with panic. "Does it matter?" Candy shot back, grabbing his hand and pulling him down the corridor. "Just run." They ran, the ship shaking and groaning around them. The walls seemed to pulse and writhe, as if the ship itself were alive. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and the smell, the smell, was almost unbearable. But they kept running, driven by sheer adrenaline and the desperate hope of escape. Finally, they burst into a large, circular room. In the center of the room was a glowing portal, its edges flickering with green light. Beyond the portal, they could see the familiar neon glow of Los Angeles. "Is that home?" Max asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Only one way to find out," Lola said, grabbing his hand. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. They leapt through the portal, the world spinning around them in a blur of light and sound. And then, with a sudden jolt, they were back in Lola's mansion, standing in the middle of the ruined living room. The guests were gone, the windows were still shattered, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and champagne. For a long moment, they just stood there, staring at each other in stunned silence. "Well," Candy said finally, brushing a strand of platinum blonde hair out of her face. "That was something." "Yeah," Lola agreed, her voice shaky. "But at least we're—" Before she could finish, the ground beneath them began to shake. They turned to see the portal flickering back to life, the green light growing brighter. And then, with a sound that was equal parts horrifying and absurd, The melted candle alien stumbled through, its too many eyes blinking in confusion. "Oh, come on," Duke shouted, throwing his hands in the air. "What does it take to get rid of these guys?" The alien raised a clawed hand, pointing at them. "You cannot escape," it rasped. "We will find you. We will become beautiful." And then, with a final, gurgling screech, it collapsed onto the floor, its body dissolving into a puddle of green goo. The four of them stared at the puddle, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. "Okay," Max said finally, breaking the silence. "I'm gonna need a drink." The story would continue to escalate, with the aliens' attempts to capture Lola, Candy, Duke, and Max growing increasingly absurd and surreal. The group would uncover a deeper conspiracy involving the aliens' obsession with human beauty and their plans to invade Earth, leading to a climactic showdown that blends horror, comedy, and suspense. The narrative would remain seamless, with twists and turns that keep the reader hooked until the very end. The green goo that was once the melted candle alien bubbled ominously on the floor of Lola's mansion, emitting a faint, acrid smell that made everyone's eyes water. Lola, Candy, Duke, and Max stood in a loose circle around it, their expressions a mix of disgust, disbelief, and exhaustion. "So," Duke said, breaking the silence, "are we just gonna ignore the fact that we were almost turned into alien smoothies, or?" "I'm not ignoring it," Candy said, her arms crossed. "I'm just trying to figure out how to bill this as a tax write-off. Alien abduction expenses has a nice ring to it." Lola crouched down, poking at the goo with a broken champagne flute she'd picked up from the floor. "This stuff is alive," she said, her voice low. "I think it's moving." The goo quivered under the glass, as if responding to her words. Max took a step back, his hands raised. "Nope, nope. I'm out. I didn't sign up for sentient alien slime." Before anyone could respond, the goo suddenly surged upward, forming a wobbly, tentacle-like appendage that lashed out at Lola. She yelped and jumped back, dropping the champagne flute. The goo absorbed it, the glass dissolving with a faint hiss. "Okay, that's it," Candy said, grabbing a fire extinguisher from the wall. "Time to take out the trash." She aimed the extinguisher at the goo and pulled the trigger, unleashing a cloud of white foam. The goo shrieked, a sound that was somehow both high-pitched and gurgly, and began to retreat, shrinking into a small, quivering puddle. "Nice shot," Duke said, impressed. "Thanks," Candy replied, smirking. "I've had practice dealing with slimy guys." The goose suddenly shot across the floor, heading straight for Max. He let out a yelp and jumped onto the couch, his muscles flexing in panic. "Why does it always go for me?" he shouted. "Maybe it thinks you're the prettiest," Lola said, half joking. "Not helping." Max yelled as the goo began to climb the couch. Candy aimed the fire extinguisher again, but before she could fire, the goo suddenly stopped. It quivered for a moment, then began to glow, emitting a soft, pulsating light. The light grew brighter and brighter, until it was almost blinding. And then, with a sound like a wet firework, the goo exploded, sending tiny droplets flying in every direction. "Ew," Lola shouted, wiping a droplet off her cheek. "What the hell was that?" Before anyone could answer, the droplets began to move, skittering across the floor like tiny, hyperactive insects. They converged in the center of the room, forming a small, glowing orb. The orb pulsed once, twice, and then shot upward, embedding itself in the ceiling. Is that bad?" Duke asked, his voice hesitant. As if in response, the ceiling began to crack, the plaster crumbling away to reveal a network of glowing green veins. The veins pulsed with the same rhythm as the orb, spreading rapidly across the ceiling and down the walls. "Oh, this is definitely bad," Candy said, backing away. The room began to shake, the walls groaning as the veins spread. The air grew thick and heavy, and the smell, the smell, was unbearable. It was like rotting flowers and burnt plastic, with a hint of something sweet and sickly. "We need to get out of here," Lola said, her voice urgent. "Now." They bolted for the door, but before they could reach it, the veins surged forward, forming a thick, pulsating barrier. The barrier rippled and shifted, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape. It had too many eyes, too many limbs, and a mouth that stretched from ear to ear, if it had ears. "You cannot escape," the barrier said, its voice a guttural rasp. "We will become beautiful." "Yeah, we've heard that before," Candy snapped, brandishing the fire extinguisher. "In newsflash, you're not getting any prettier." The barrier lunged at them, its too many limbs flailing. Lola grabbed a decorative vase from a nearby table and hurled it at the barrier. The vase shattered on impact, but the barrier didn't even flinch. "Okay, new plan," Duke said, his voice panicked. "Run." They turned and bolted down the hallway, the barrier close behind. The veins were spreading faster now, covering the walls and floor, making it hard to keep their footing. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and the smell was overwhelming. "This way," Lola shouted, leading them toward the back door. They burst into the backyard, the cool night air a welcome relief. But the relief was short-lived. The veins had already spread outside, covering the pool, the patio furniture, and even the trees. The entire property was alive, pulsing with the same sickly green light. "What the hell is happening?" Max shouted, his voice tinged with hysteria. "I think the ship infected the house," Lola said, her voice trembling. "It's turning it into one of them." As if to confirm her theory, the ground beneath them began to shake. The pool water churned and bubbled, rising into the air in a swirling vortex. The patio furniture twisted and contorted, forming grotesque, alien shapes. And the trees, the trees, began to uproot themselves, their branches writhing like tentacles. "We need to get off this property," Candy said, her voice urgent. "Now." They ran for the gate, but before they could reach it, the ground erupted, sending them flying in different directions. Lola landed hard on the grass, the wind knocked out of her. She looked up just in time to see the barrier, now fully formed and even more grotesque, looming over her. "You will help us," it rasped, reaching for her with a clawed hand. Before it could grab her, a loud bang echoed through the air. The barrier jerked backward, a gaping hole in its chest. Lola turned to see Candy standing a few feet away, holding a shotgun she'd apparently grabbed from the house. "Back off, ugly," Candy said, her voice cold. The barrier let out a gurgling screech and lunged at her, but Candy fired again, blowing another hole in its chest. The barrier staggered, its too many eyes blinking in confusion. And then, with a final, wet gurgle, it collapsed into a puddle of goo. "Nice shot," Duke said, helping Lola to her feet. "Thanks," Candy replied, smirking. "I've had practice dealing with clingy guys." The ground began to shake again, and the veins surged forward, converging on the puddle. The puddle began to grow, forming a massive, pulsating mound. The mound quivered and shifted, taking on a new shape, a shape that was even more grotesque and terrifying than the last. "Oh, come on," Max shouted, throwing his hands in the air. "What does it take to kill these things?" "I don't think we can," Lola said, her voice filled with dread. "I think they're evolving." The mound let out a deafening roar, its too many mouths opening wide. And then, with a sound that was equal parts horrifying and absurd, it began to chase them. The story would continue to escalate, with the aliens' attempts to capture Lola, Candy, Duke, and Max growing increasingly bizarre and surreal. The group would uncover a deeper conspiracy involving the aliens' obsession with human beauty and their plans to invade Earth, leading to a climactic showdown that blends horror, comedy, and suspense. The narrative would remain seamless, with twists and turns that keep the reader hooked until the very end. Let's dive deeper into the chaos and absurdity. The aliens' evolution takes a turn for the even more bizarre, and Lola, Candy, Duke, and Max must confront the horrifying truth about the aliens' ultimate plan. Here's the next segment. The massive, pulsating mound of alien goo roared again, its too many mouths gnashing and drooling as it lurched toward them. The ground shook with each step it took, the veins in the earth writhing like serpents. Lola, Candy, Duke, and Max scrambled backward, their eyes wide with terror. "Okay, new plan," Duke shouted, his voice cracking. "We blow this place up and run like hell."
With what?
Candy snapped, clutching the shotgun. "A lighter and some hairspray? I don't know." Duke shot back. "I'm improvising here." The mound lunged, its gelatinous body stretching and contorting in ways that defied physics. Lola grabbed Max's arm and yanked him out of the way just as a pseudopod slammed into the ground where he'd been standing. The impact sent chunks of dirt and grass flying, and the air filled with the stench of rotting flowers and burnt plastic. "We can't keep running," Lola shouted, her voice desperate. "We need to fight back."
With what?
Max yelled, his muscles flexing as he dodged another pseudopod. "This thing eats everything we throw at it." Candy fired the shotgun again, blowing a hole in the mound's side. The hole closed almost instantly, the goo reforming with a sickening squelch. "Yeah, this isn't working," she said, her voice grim. The mound roared again, its too many eyes narrowing in what could only be described as alien rage. It surged forward, its body expanding and contracting like a grotesque, gelatinous wave. Lola, Candy, Duke, and Max turned and ran, their feet pounding against the pulsating ground. They reached the edge of the property, only to find the gate blocked by a wall of writhing veins. The veins twisted and coiled, forming a barrier that pulsed with the same sickly green light as the mound. "Great," Duke muttered. "We're trapped." "Not yet," Lola said, her eyes scanning the area. She spotted a garden shed a few feet away, its door hanging open. "There. Let's go." They sprinted for the shed, the mound close behind. Lola yanked the door open, and they piled inside, slamming it shut behind them. The shed was small and cramped, filled with gardening tools, bags of fertilizer, and a rusty lawnmower. The air was thick with the smell of dirt and gasoline. "Now what?" Max asked, his voice panicked. "We can't stay in here forever." "We don't have to," Lola said, her eyes lighting up. She grabbed a can of gasoline from the corner and held it up. "We burn it." "Burn what?" Duke asked, his brow furrowing. "Everything," Lola said, her voice filled with determination. "The shed, the yard, the house, everything. If we can't kill it, we'll trap it." Candy grinned, her eyes gleaming with a mix of excitement and madness. "I like the way you think." They quickly got to work, dousing the shed and its contents with gasoline. The mound roared outside, its pseudopods slamming against the walls. The shed shook, the wood creaking and splintering under the force of the attacks. "Hurry," Max shouted, his voice tinged with hysteria. Lola grabbed a box of matches from a shelf and struck one, the flame flickering in the dim light. She looked at the others, her expression grim. "Ready?" "Do it," Candy said, her voice steady. Lola dropped the match. The shed erupted in flames, the heat intense and overwhelming. They barely had time to dive out the door before the entire structure was engulfed. The mound let out a deafening roar as the flames spread, consuming the veins and the pulsating ground. The air filled with the smell of burning plastic and alien goo, and the green light began to flicker and fade. "It's working," Duke shouted, his voice filled with relief. But their relief was short-lived. The mound surged forward, its body writhing and twisting as it tried to escape the flames. It let out a guttural screech, its too many eyes narrowing in hatred. And then, with a sound that was equal parts horrifying and absurd, it began to sing. The sound was unlike anything they'd ever heard, a discordant, gurgling melody that made their skin crawl. The mound's too many mouths moved in unison, forming words that were almost recognizable. "We will be beautiful," it sang, its voice a grotesque parody of a pop ballad. "Oh, come on," Candy shouted, covering her ears. "This is just ridiculous." The singing grew louder, the melody more insistent. The flames began to die down, the veins reforming and spreading once more. The mound's body grew larger, its too many eyes glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. "It's not working," Lola said, her voice filled with despair. "We can't stop it. There has to be something we can do, Max said, his voice trembling. Something we're missing. Lola's eyes widened as a thought struck her. The portal, she said, her voice urgent. The one we came through. If we can open it again, maybe we can send it back? And how do we do that? Duke asked, his brow furrowing. I don't know, Lola admitted, but it's our only shot. They turned and ran back toward the house, the mound close behind. The ground was still pulsating, the veins writhing and twisting beneath their feet. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and the smell was overwhelming. They reached the living room, where the portal had first appeared. The green light was faint now, barely visible amidst the chaos. Lola grabbed a piece of broken glass from the floor and held it up, her hands trembling. What are you doing? Candy asked, her voice filled with confusion. I'm going to try to reactivate it, Lola said, her voice uncertain. If I can cut myself, maybe the blood will. I don't know, do something? That's the dumbest plan I've ever heard, Duke said, his voice filled with disbelief. Got a better idea? Lola shot back. Before Duke could respond, the mound burst through the wall, its too many mouths gnashing and drooling. It let out a deafening roar, its too many eyes narrowing in hatred. Do it, Candy shouted, her voice urgent. Lola took a deep breath and sliced her palm with the glass. The blood dripped onto the floor, mixing with the green light. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, with a sound like a wet firework, the portal flared to life, its edges flickering with green light. It worked, Max shouted, his voice filled with relief. The mound roared again, its too many limbs flailing as it lunged toward them. Lola, Candy, Duke, and Max dove out of the way, the portal glowing brighter and brighter. The mound stumbled forward, its too many eyes widening in panic. Now, Lola shouted, her voice filled with desperation. They grabbed whatever they could find, chairs, tables, broken glass, and hurled it at the mound, driving it toward the portal. The mound let out a guttural screech, its too many mouths opening wide. And then, with a final, deafening roar, it was sucked into the portal, its body dissolving into a swirling vortex of green light. The portal flickered once, twice, and then collapsed, leaving behind only a faint, acrid smell and a puddle of green goo. For a long moment, they just stood there, staring at the spot where the portal had been. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and alien goo, and the ground was still pulsating faintly. Is it over? Max asked, his voice trembling. I think so, Lola said, her voice filled with exhaustion. Candy let out a shaky laugh, her eyes gleaming with a mix of relief and hysteria. Well, that was something. Duke slumped to the floor, his head in his hands. I need a drink. The story would continue to explore the aftermath of their ordeal, with the group grappling with the surreal and horrifying events they've just experienced. The aliens' obsession with beauty would take on a deeper, more sinister meaning, leading to a climactic showdown that blends horror, comedy, and suspense. The narrative would remain seamless, with twists and turns that keep the reader hooked until the very end. Got it? Let's dive into the final chapter of this surreal, darkly comedic, and thrilling story. I'll ensure it's meaningful, logically consistent with the previous content, and delivers a satisfying and impactful ending that ties everything together. Here we go. The portal collapsed with a final, wet pop, leaving behind only a faint, acrid smell and a puddle of green goo. Lola, Candy, Duke, and Max stood in the ruins of Lola's mansion, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. The ground had stopped pulsating, the veins had receded, and the air was finally clear of that sickly green light. But the silence was deafening. Is it over? Max asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lola stared at the spot where the portal had been, her mind racing. I don't know, she said, her voice hollow. But if it's not, I don't think I can fight anymore. Candy slumped to the floor, her platinum blonde hair matted with sweat and dirt. I just want a shower, she muttered. And a margarita. A really big margarita. Duke let out a shaky laugh, running a hand through his disheveled hair. I think we all deserve one. But as they sat there, catching their breath and trying to process what had just happened. A faint sound reached their ears. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. A gurgling, squelching sound, like something wet and heavy moving across the floor. Lola's eyes widened. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." They turned to see the puddle of green goo quivering, its surface rippling as if something beneath it were stirring. The goo began to bubble and expand, forming a small, glowing orb. The orb pulsed once, twice, and then shot upward, embedding itself in the ceiling. "Oh, come on," Candy shouted, throwing her hands in the air. "What does it take to kill these things?" The ceiling began to crack, the plaster crumbling away to reveal a network of glowing green veins. The veins pulsed with the same rhythm as the orb, spreading rapidly across the ceiling and down the walls. "We need to get out of here," Duke said, his voice urgent. "Now." But before they could move, the veins surged forward, forming a thick, pulsating barrier. The barrier rippled and shifted, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape. It had too many eyes, too many limbs, and a mouth that stretched from ear to ear, if it had ears. "You cannot escape," the barrier said, its voice a guttural rasp. "We will become beautiful." Lola's heart sank. "It's not over," she said, her voice filled with despair. "It's never going to be over." But then, something unexpected happened. The barrier's too many eyes blinked in unison, and its too many limbs began to twitch and jerk, as if it were struggling against something. The veins in the walls began to pulse erratically, the green light flickering and fading. "What's happening?" Max asked, his voice filled with confusion. "I don't know," Lola said, her eyes narrowing, "but it looks like it's fighting itself." The barrier let out a guttural screech, its too many mouths opening wide. And then, with a sound that was equal parts horrifying and absurd, it began to sing. The sound was unlike anything they'd ever heard, a discordant, gurgling melody that made their skin crawl. The barrier's too many mouths moved in unison, forming words that were almost recognizable. "We will be beautiful," it sang, its voice a grotesque parody of a pop ballad. But as it sang, the veins in the walls began to wither and die, the green light fading to nothing. The barrier's too many eyes widened in panic, and its too many limbs flailed wildly. And then, with a final, wet gurgle, it collapsed into a puddle of goo. The goo quivered for a moment, then began to dissolve, evaporating into a fine, green mist. The mist hung in the air for a moment, then dissipated, leaving behind only a faint, acrid smell. For a long moment, they just stood there, staring at the spot where the barrier had been. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and alien goo, and the ground was still pulsating faintly. "Is it over?" Max asked, his voice trembling. "I think so," Lola said, her voice filled with exhaustion. Candy let out a shaky laugh, her eyes gleaming with a mix of relief and hysteria. "Well, that was something." Duke slumped to the floor, his head in his hands. "I need a drink." Weeks later, Lola, Candy, Duke, and Max sat on the patio of a beachside bar, the sun setting over the ocean. The events of that night still haunted them, but they had found solace in each other's company. They had been through something no one else could understand, and it had bonded them in a way nothing else could. "Do you think they'll come back?" Max asked, his voice quiet. Lola shook her head. "I don't think so. I think they were trying to understand us, to become like us, but they didn't know how." "Yeah, well, they had a funny way of showing it," Candy said, taking a sip of her margarita. Duke chuckled. "I'll say. But you know, in a weird way, I almost feel sorry for them. They just wanted to be beautiful." Lola nodded, her eyes distant. "Beauty isn't something you can steal or copy. It's not about how you look. It's about who you are. And I think they finally realized that." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the waves crash against the shore. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. And for the first time in weeks, they felt at peace. "You know," Candy said, breaking the silence, If anyone ever tries to make a movie about this, I'm suing." They all laughed, the sound echoing across the beach. And for a moment, just a moment, it felt like everything was going to be okay.